When a company loses its head of safety, it doesn't collapse all at once. It collapses slowly, quietly, like a foundation settling, until the day something heavy lands on it. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Hamilton, Ontario, drinking the first coffee of the morning and watching a light snow come down over the backyard when my phone rang. It was my old colleague, the one who'd stayed behind when I left, and he wasn't calling to catch up. "They're in serious trouble," he said. "The provincial inspector is coming back next week, and nobody knows where anything is." I told him I was sorry to hear that, and I was. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't something else mixed in with the sympathy. Something quieter, something that had been sitting in my chest for 14 months. I spent 23 years at Lakeview Industrial Fabrication. We made structural components, steel framing, load-bearing assemblies, custom metalwork for commercial construction projects, all across Ontario and into Quebec. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that gets written up in business magazines. But it was honest, and it mattered. And for 2 decades I was the person who made sure Revoked every shipment, every inspection record, every WorkSafe filing was exactly where it needed to be. My title was Director of Safety and Regulatory Compliance. What that actually meant was, I was the one person in the building who understood that the Ministry of Labour didn't care about your quarterly targets, that the Canadian Standards Association didn't care about your cash flow situation, and that a missed deadline on a Form 1000 could hold up a job site in Mississauga for 6 weeks while lawyers sorted things out. I didn't start there as director. I started on the shop floor 23 years old, running a MIG welder for a crew of older guys who called me the kid for 3 years until I stopped making mistakes. I moved into quality inspection, then process documentation, then compliance coordination. And eventually, they gave me the office with the frosted glass window and the title that sounded important, but mostly meant I never fully left not work, not even on weekends. I knew where every permit was filed. I knew which inspectors preferred documentation organized by job number versus date, and which ones wanted a physical binder versus digital. I knew that our insurance carrier had a specific clause about safety audit frequency, and that if we slipped below the required inspection cycle, our general liability coverage had a 60-day cure period before they could void a claim. I knew these things because I'd lived through the situations that taught them. My wife used to say I carried the company around in my head the way other people carry their grocery lists. She wasn't wrong. The man who decided I was unnecessary was not someone who had spent time on a shop floor. He arrived as the new Chief Operating Officer in the spring, brought in by the board after the previous COO retired, and within 6 weeks he had opinions about everything. His background was in retail distribution. He'd spent his career moving consumer goods through logistics networks, and he was very good at it, I'm sure. He understood margin analysis and headcount ratios and the kind of efficiency metrics that look clean on a slide deck. What he did not understand, what he showed no interest in understanding, was that a fabrication facility is not a distribution center. The regulatory environment is different. The liability exposure is different. The consequences of a documentation failure are not a delayed shipment. They are a stop work order, a 6-figure fine, and potentially a criminal investigation if someone gets hurt. He called me into a meeting in late October. His assistant was there, taking notes. He slid a printed spreadsheet across the table and said, "We've been reviewing departmental overhead, and your function is one of the areas where we think there's room to restructure." I looked at the spreadsheet. My salary, my team's salaries, our budget for external audits and training and certification renewals, our software licensing for the compliance management system, all of it was highlighted in yellow. "When you say restructure," I said, "we're going to consolidate the function into HR and operations. Most of what your team does can be handled with the right software and a part-time coordinator." I was quiet for a moment. I wanted to be careful about what I said next, because I'd been in enough difficult meetings to know that how you respond in the first 60 seconds determines whether you get to have a real conversation or whether the decision has already been made and you're just being informed. "With respect," I said, "I'd like to understand what specific functions you believe can be automated, because some of what we manage has legal obligations attached that don't simplify easily." He smiled the way people smile when they think you're being defensive about your own job. "We've looked at it carefully. The savings are significant and we're confident in the plan." The savings were significant. I learned later that the number they'd put in the board presentation was $480,000 annually. My team of 3 plus all the associated costs. Against a company that was doing 60+ million in revenue, it looked like an easy win on paper. I drove home that evening and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. My wife was making dinner and she could tell from the way I came through the door that something had happened. "They're letting me go," I said. She put down the wooden spoon. "When?" "End of the month." She didn't say anything right away. We'd been married long enough that she knew when I needed a minute before she started asking questions. I gave them 30 days notice, which was more than they asked for. During those 30 days, I documented everything I could in a format that a non-specialist might be able to follow. I wasn't doing it to be gracious. I was doing it because those regulatory files were partly my professional reputation, and I didn't want my name attached to incomplete records. I handed over binders, digital folders, a written summary of every active compliance matter and its current status, every upcoming deadline, every inspector relationship that needed to be maintained. The part-time coordinator they hired to replace my function of 3 people was a woman who'd previously worked in administrative support at a dental practice. She was not at fault for what happened. She was put in an impossible position and given inadequate resources, and told it would be manageable. My last day was our Friday in November. The CEO sent an email to the company saying they were grateful for my contributions and wishing me well. A few colleagues stopped by my office. My team, the 2 people whose positions were also being eliminated, had a quiet lunch with me at the Thai place on King Street that we'd been going to for years. I cleared out my desk, drove home and did not look back. For a few months, I did consulting work. Small manufacturers, mostly, who needed help getting their compliance programs up to code before an audit. The work was steady enough and I found I was reasonably good at it. Better than I'd expected, honestly, because I'd been inside a large operation long enough to understand what the common failure points were. My wife and I talked about whether I should look for another in-house director role or stay on this consulting path. We didn't rush the decision. Our youngest was finishing her 2nd year at McMaster, and our mortgage had 4 years left on it, so there was some financial pressure, but nothing that required a panicked pivot. I was managing. That's the honest word for it. Managing. The call that changed things came on a Thursday afternoon in January, 14 months after I'd left Lakeview. It was my old colleague, the one who'd been there longer than almost anyone, and his voice had a particular quality to it. Not panicked, more like the voice of a person watching something slow motion that they can't stop. "Ministry inspector is coming back," he said, "next week. Unannounced, technically, but someone tipped them off. Tipped them off about what? The Thompson contract." I knew what the Thompson contract was. It was the reason I'd stayed a little later than usual on several evenings in my last weeks at Lakeview. A large commercial construction project in the Waterloo region, a mixed-use development, multi-story, the kind of job that required very specific documentation under the Ontario Construction Projects Regulation. Structural components had to be certified, installation methods had to be pre-approved, a site-specific safety plan had to be filed with the regional ministry office before a single piece of our product touched that job site. "Is the safety plan filed?" I asked. A pause. "Nobody could find it," he said. "The coordinator looked everywhere. She thinks it might have been lost in the transition when the compliance system was migrated to the new software." I closed my eyes for a second. "What about the certification documentation for the load assemblies?" "Also missing, or not missing exactly. She found some of it. She found doesn't have the engineer's stamp that the inspector asked for last year." "Which engineer?" "That's the other problem. The firm we used to use, the one you had the relationship with, apparently there's been a dispute about an outstanding invoice and they've stopped responding to emails." I sat back in my chair. What he was describing was not a paperwork inconvenience. What he was describing was a regulatory exposure that, if the inspector found it the way he was going to find it, would result in a stop work order on the Thompson site, a mandatory review of every active project, potential personal liability for the signing officers, and fines that could run into the hundreds of thousands under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And if anything had actually gone wrong on that site, if there was any safety incident that could be connected to the documentation gap, the exposure was considerably worse. "Who's handling it?" I asked. "The COO? He's trying." But he doesn't know who to call. He reached out to the engineers, but like I said, they're not responding. He doesn't know the inspector's name. He doesn't know what the specific filing requirements are. He called the ministry main line and got put on hold for 40 minutes, and then they told him to submit a written inquiry. I didn't say anything. I shouldn't even be calling you, my old colleague said, but I thought you should know. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, a Hamilton area code, but not a contact in my phone. I almost didn't answer. It was the COO. His voice was different than it had been in that October meeting. The confidence was still there, but it was working harder than usual. Forced. "I'm sure this call is awkward," he said, "and I understand if you don't want to have it. But I want to be straightforward with you. We have a situation, and I'm not sure we have the right people internally to navigate it, and your name came up." I let him He explained the situation. The Thompson project, the documentation gaps, the inspector coming next week, the engineering firm that had gone quiet. He laid it out clearly. I'll give him that. He wasn't minimizing. When he finished, I said, "What are you asking me? Whether you'd be willing to come in as a consultant, on a contract basis, short-term engagement to help us get through this review. What's the timeline?" Inspector arrives Tuesday. It was Thursday. I told him I'd think about it and call him back by end of day. I sat with it for an hour. My wife came home and I told her about the calls. She listened, and when I was done she said, "What do you want to do?" "Part of me wants to say no," I said, "and part of me can't leave something in that state. Those are real buildings going up. Real people on those sites." She nodded. She'd known me long enough to know that the second part was going to win. I called him back at 4:30 and gave him my consulting rate, which was considerably higher than what my salary had worked out to hourly. He didn't argue. He said that's fine in the tone of a man who has stopped caring about the line items. I was in the building by 7 the next morning. The coordinator was a nervous, capable person who had been genuinely trying to manage something she'd been set up to fail at. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't the problem. She'd been handed a filing system she hadn't been trained on, a software platform that had been half migrated when the vendor changed, and a portfolio of active projects with regulatory requirements she hadn't been briefed on. We worked through Friday and into Saturday. I found most of the documentation, not lost, just misfiled in the new system under categories that didn't match the old structure. The site safety plan for Thompson was there. It just wasn't where anyone had looked. The engineer's stamped certification was in a physical binder in a cabinet that had been moved to the storage room when they redid the office layout. The engineering firm was the harder problem. I knew the principal there. We'd worked together for 11 years. I called him directly on his cell on Saturday afternoon and had a straightforward conversation. There was an outstanding invoice of just under $9,000 from a project 6 months ago that had gotten lost in their billing system transition. Once I confirmed that and relayed it to the COO, a payment was arranged by Monday morning. I spent Sunday writing a summary brief for the inspector. Not defensive, not explanatory, just clear. Here is the project, here is the documentation, here is the certification chain, here is what was filed and when and by whom. The inspector arrived Tuesday morning. He was the same one I'd dealt with for years, a methodical man from Brantford who had been doing this work for a long time and had no patience for incomplete files but a great deal of respect for organized ones. He spent 3 hours going through everything. At the end, he sat down with me in the boardroom. I was the one who met with him because the COO had the good sense to let someone who knew the language handle the conversation. And he said, "Your documentation is in order. I'm noting a lapse in the internal review cycle that you'll need to remediate, but I don't see grounds for enforcement action at this time." He left without issuing a stop work order. The C shook my hand in the hallway and said, "We owe you." I said, "Yes, you do." I finished out the consulting engagement over the next 3 weeks. I rebuilt the compliance calendar from scratch, documented every active regulatory obligation and its deadline, re-established the relationship with the engineering firm formally through a new service agreement, and wrote a 30-page procedural manual for the coordinator so she had something real to work from. I also submitted a separate memo, addressed to the board, not the COO, outlining the specific regulatory exposures that had been created by the restructuring decision and recommending that the compliance function be restored as a standalone department with appropriate staffing. I did not recommend they hire me back. That was a deliberate choice. I wanted the recommendation to read as professional advice, not a pitch for my own re-employment. They offered me a permanent position anyway. The board chair called me personally 3 weeks after the inspection. He was direct about it. They understood now what they'd lost, they wanted to make it right, and they were prepared to offer terms that reflected that understanding. I took 2 weeks to think about it, talked to my wife, talked to my accountant, thought about the consulting work and whether I wanted to keep building that or whether I wanted to go back to the work I actually knew better than anything. In the end, I went back, not because I needed to prove something, not for the satisfaction of walking back through those doors, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. I went back because the work matters and I'm good at it, and the building I'd spent 23 years maintaining was still standing and still needed someone who understood why. The CEO left the company 8 months later. The board didn't renew his contract. I don't know if those two things were connected. I've learnt not to ask questions I don't need the answers to. My old colleague and I have lunch sometimes, still at the Thai place on King Street. He's retiring next year, and he's looking forward to it in the way of a man who has earned every day of it. A few months ago, over pad thai, he said something that I've thought about since. You know what the difference is between you and the guys who make those decisions. They think the company is the numbers. You always knew the company was the knowledge. I didn't have a good response to that. I just thought about it on the drive home, through the grey Hamilton afternoon, the lake somewhere off to the north behind the clouds. The knowledge doesn't show up on a spreadsheet. It doesn't have a line item. And the day you think you can cut it out and replace it with a software subscription and a part-time coordinator, you'd better hope your next inspection is on a Tuesday and not a Monday, because on Monday you're going to need someone who still has the engineer's cell number. I'm the person who has the engineer's cell number. I've always been that person. And now they know it too.